a character can have conflict either within themselves or with their antagonist. So if your protagonist wants something, they might not know how to express it, or they might not know how to go about it. That's an internal conflict within them. And then if they have a conflict with the antagonist over something that they both want, that's also a way to drive your story forward. So I think it's also important to realize that two sides, whether it be your antagonist and your protagonist, often have different stories about the same event. And that might be the driving focus. So they might be in an argument over how something happened or their beliefs about something, and they don't want to compromise or see eye to eye to it. And a lot of that's based on fear too, which is, I notice, something that's mentioned in here, which is helpful, because a lot of conflict at the end of the day is based on fear. And how that character handles that, I think, is really fun to explore in the story. So.
Hi. And so it's also cool to remember when you're thinking about internal and external conflict that they can be related. And sometimes an internal conflict can make an external conflict even harder. For example, if you were writing a story where your protagonist and your antagonist both want to be the star in the school play, that's an external conflict. But if your protagonist is also really shy and she gets bad stage fright, that's an internal conflict that is also just ramping up the stakes for your story and making it more exciting.
And to add to that, maybe it's the nonfiction writer in me, but just like with real people in real life, you all have desires and things that you want, and that you're constantly like negotiating with each other how like you live and function in your stories next to each other. And so just, I think a really interesting thing in stories is seeing people that have flaws next to each other. I know you love your protagonist. That's why he or she or they are your protagonist. However, like, make sure that that person is complicated and complex, just like you are. And then you have this idea of putting people that are different from each other next to each other and letting the story.
So building off of what my friends here were saying, obstacles make conflict a lot more interesting. So it's not very interesting if you have a conflict, to use your example of the school play. If both characters just get cast in the play, that's not very interesting. But if there's a lot of obstacles in their way, if there's a lot of auditions, or if there's a lot of scheduling conflicts, if your protagonist is shy, that makes your conflict way more interesting because there's a lot of hurdles that your protagonist has to jump over. Obstacles often depend on cause and effect action. So if your protagonist is shy, that has the effect that it's difficult for your protagonist to be in a school play. So thinking a lot about what is causing, what cause and effect action has on your character's conflicts is an interesting thing to think about.
I think it's also important to think about how to resolve those conflicts. Therefore, you can connect to your reader, and your reader will be right along with your protagonist in that voyage that they have to take to resolve those conflicts. And then you're having this connection with your reader, and you're also building interest in your readers. So I hope that helps.
I think one more question you guys can keep in mind when you're building these conflicts is to ask for your character what is at risk. And for a lot of these characters, the conflicts that you're putting them in, it's because something about the personality makes the situation really uncomfortable and hard to get through. So what is at risk for them? What are they going to lose? Or what do they think they're going to lose by being in this situation? And then coming out through the conflict on the other side, how are they stronger and more resilient after that? And I think if you keep that in mind, it can make for a really powerful, compelling story. So.
Well, most times there's conflict between two people, but sometimes there can also be conflict with inanimate things. So a character can have a conflict with the environment. So we know a lot of movies where someone is on a plane and then gets stranded in some snowy place. And so the whole movie is about them being in conflict with the environment and trying to survive.
I think a lot of good conflict comes from whether the characters were friends. Let's say it's two people in the conflict instead of an internal conflict. If they were friends or family, and let's say they had a fight, and both characters are not seeing eye to eye, or they're not making compromises and not talking about it, but the protagonist wants more than anything else to be friends again. But he or she is afraid of being rejected as a friend or not being accepted as a friend, and I think that's kind of a relatable way to think about it, is in terms of friendship or relationships with people, and just wanting to have the best relationship with each other.
In addition to that, a good place to always start with a story is what are the stakes, and not like steaks like from a cow, but like stakes like what is the like thing that the protagonist could stand to lose or fail at. And so if you start your story with like, okay, well, what does my character want, and like how could this character potentially like not getting or not getting that thing, or having the resolution or not having the resolution, how does that change this character's way of being?
You might also want to consider, when you're deciding what your character wants most in the world, why they want it. Like, say, if someone wanted to be a famous painter, what is it about painting that made them decide to do that? And maybe you can find your stakes somewhere in there.
Conflict can also come out of your characters themselves. So I know my students, they wrote out in their charts, excuse me, they wrote out very well-crafted characters that had a lot of interests and a lot of likes and dislikes, and they had very strong opinions about things. So thinking about what your character is interested in, and making sure that that conflict stays in character. So if you have a character that is a picky eater, and they get signed up for a food eating contest, that could be a conflict right there. But if they're not a picky eater and they get signed up for a food contest, then that's not really very interesting, is it? So looking inside of your characters, what they like, what they dislike, what they're interested in, where they come from, things in their past that might frighten them or might make them associate certain things with other things, is a great way to begin building conflict in your story.
Writing about what you know, I think that is a good way to start, but also I think you can think about writing about what you're interested in. So, for example, if you're interested in gymnastics or soccer, you can do your research on that, and then you can build your characters based on whatever it is that you're learning. The more you study what it is that your characters are interested in, the more you will inform your story. So I think it also goes to like what it is that you want to learn about that you can use with your characters.
Yeah, I just kind of want to echo that a little bit. I mean, it's hard for me to put myself in the head of a 40-year-old lawyer too. That's, so I'm with you guys there. And I think you should write what you know, but I also think you should limit yourselves. You should feel free to, follow your imagination, and I think keep maybe the feelings of your characters relatable to you. But if you want to write a story about a dinosaur hunter, don't stop yourself from doing it, because that sounds fun. So.
Make sure you also remember the things that you know don't necessarily have to be yourself. You know about your siblings and your parents and your friends. So what you know can be things that you've observed, and it doesn't necessarily have to be things that you experienced. I've written stories that have to do with things that my friends have told me, things that my parents have told me about when they were growing up or when they were my age. So just remembering that you don't have to limit yourself to, you can write about dinosaur hunters, but even if you don't know about dinosaur hunters in person, you can, just sort of observe around you as well.
It's also nice to remember that ideas don't expire. So say you're writing your first story right now. It doesn't need to be the dinosaur story if you don't think you're ready for it, because every bit of writing you ever do is going to help you get better and better. And one day you're going to feel like your writing is at that level to tackle this big imaginative dinosaur hunter story. So you can always keep something in your back pocket, keep thinking about it, and write what is more familiar to you right now.
I think this is sort of like the age-old writing question, right? Like, do you write what you know, or can you write about anything? So it's good that you're starting now. But I do think that as far as this is concerned, that, like, let's say your protagonist really wants to be a wizard. And this is not something that I feel that maybe any of us particularly know very well. But in that task, there are things that you know and experience. Like, you might know about jealousy. You might know about, like, somebody hurting your feelings. So there are still things in an unrealistic, made-up world that you do know and you are able to write about. And so being able to balance the two, I think, is the way to go about it.
The best thing about a story is that you can live in it for a while. So if your character has no weaknesses, then they're going to win right away, and then the story's over. So you want to give them a few things that they're not so good at, or make things difficult for them, so you can write a longer story. For example, the Shy example is pretty good. If she is just totally brave and she just kills it at the audition and everyone loves her right away, then the story is just over on page 1. So put things in your way. It doesn't always need to be a physical object that makes them tired, like Superman with kryptonite. It could be it might be just a personality failing. It just might be someone who isn't very nice to their siblings. Or, for example, Harry Potter, his weakness is that he's always rushing into danger without thinking about it. So you can come up with a lot of different weaknesses for your character that don't just have to be the physical.
It's also important to give your character weaknesses, because even when you're working in fantasy worlds that are unrealistic, you want your characters to seem very real. You want your reader to be able to recognize elements in your characters that seem like they're real people. And unfortunately, real people have a lot of weaknesses and a lot of flaws. And even though that's not a fun thing to admit, having certain weaknesses, alongside certain good traits about your character can make your character seem really well-rounded and very real. I can't think of a single person that I know that doesn't have one sort of flaw about them, even if it's something as simple as biting their nails or not doing their homework on time. So making sure that you sort of pinpoint these little realistic characteristics in your characters can really sort of help your story.
Another thing about weaknesses is they're going to be one of those main factors about your characters that are going to keep driving the story forward. So they're going to be able to be some sort of tools that'll help you create some more details in the scene and help you draw those out.
What I was thinking about was that beyond just driving the story forward, we also want our audience, our readers, to connect with our characters. And we don't connect with people that have things that come too easy to them. We want to see people struggle like we struggle every day to accomplish things. You know what I mean? So, like, for example, I like Batman more than I like Superman, because Superman's he's just kind of too good at his job. You know what I mean? But he has, he's super strength, he can laser vision, but then, Batman has to try a lot harder. He's just a regular guy. You know what I mean? And he has a lot to overcome. And when we see characters having to overcome things, like their internal weaknesses, we connect with them, we can relate to them. And that's what we want our readers to do.
I guess the thing is like, I remember being in elementary school, and I also write nonfiction, but like, I remember there was a girl that always bullied me, right? And she was my antagonist. And I was always thinking, like, why can't this girl just let me live my life and be nice to me, because we're all just flying through space doing this thing. But then I remember years later getting to a point where we actually went to like a weekend like teenage retreat thing together, and we became friends, and I got to understand that a lot of the reason why she was bullying was because of stuff that was happening in her life and some insecurities that she had. And what that does is that, one, it makes everybody in your story like very believable, right? Because nobody is perfect, and you don't want to have a protagonist that looks like, you know, totally glimmers gold. And also, I think the job of the writer is to be empathetic. Like, I think that that is one of your primary tasks, and to be empathetic means to care about all of your characters and to show them that even when they are in conflict with your protagonist, that also there is a complexity there and they're working together to create that tension.
So one thing that's really important to remember when you're writing your antagonist is the expression that everyone is the hero in their own story. So your antagonist doesn't think of themselves as an evil person. They think your antagonist, in fact, thinks of your main character as their antagonist. So remember that if they're a really complex person, they think they have good reasons for doing what they do. They might not be right, but they do believe it. And that will make your antagonist feel like a really interesting person that we're going to spend a lot of time with in this story.
So another thing to think about when you are drawing up your antagonist is that you don't want any of your characters to be boring. And that's why it's important to create good things and bad things about your characters. You have to make them realistic so they will be interesting to your reader. You never want your characters to be boring and perfect, because then you'll lose your reader's interest this way.
Going off what some of the other mentors were saying about creating a more complex antagonist is to say that, again, antagonist doesn't mean bad guy. It goes back to that first question, what do your characters want? And an antagonist is really just somebody who wants something different than what your protagonist wants, and those wants come into conflict. So, again, that conflict we're looking for.
Every writer is different, and I think it really depends. There's a process to writing, and you never really know what you will use. But it's always good to do your background on all of your characters. Therefore, you have something to inform yourself. Even if it doesn't show up in the actual words or the scenes, you will use it. Once you know what the motivations are, it will shape your stories.
Always good to remember that we're all just human beings. I'm really excited. I think you write some very exciting sentences, and I can't wait to see your stuff evolve. But now, back to the question of why you want to make a problematic protagonist.
If we're talking about weaknesses and whether your protagonist is going to use an antagonist's weakness against them, I wouldn't say that they have to use the weakness against them, but it is smart to consider it. For example, if your antagonist is really afraid of mice and your protagonist has a pet mouse, they could consider setting the mouse on the antagonist, but whether they do or not depends on what kind of protagonist you've created. But you can always put it in the mix.
That has a lot to do with conflict as well. So in terms of what kind of protagonist you've created, that can be its own tiny conflict underneath the big conflict that is your full story. Your protagonist can sort of grapple and argue with themselves about, well, now that I have this information, do I use it? Do I not use it? And it can be a question of whether or not they want to be nice or mean, or how they want to treat this other person. I know that in my workshop, in my class, when we're talking about what we write, we talk a lot about what we put on the page, and if something is on the page, that is evidence that your reader is going to sort of automatically file away and think is important, because if it wasn't important, the writer wouldn't write it on the page. So when you're thinking about what information you give to your readers, you should consider that, that your readers are having all of these sentences presented to them, and they're going to try to piece together what is important based off of what you tell them is important on the page.
With some of this character work that we've been doing so far, yes, some of it you can't put directly into the work itself, and you can't have your character's weakness come out if you want to. But some of that's also just for us as writers to know. I used to be an actor. Something we used to talk about a lot was subtext. And that's, what's going on behind the things that you're saying. So all these things that you're finding out about your characters, for example, if we have the actress character that, is auditioning for this play, but we know that she's shy. We know that in every situation, we as writers know that she's gonna come into a conversation a little bit differently than someone that was shy. We don't ever need to come out and say that she's shy, but as writers, we'll show it through her actions. So there's a lot of that work is for you guys, and will make for better, richer writing.
Thank you all very much for Skyping with us today. We really benefited from your answers. Say thank you, guys.
Thank you.